The Devastated Vineyard, Part 7. Chapter 16, Continued. How neglect of love for God leads to distortion of love of neighbor. The distortion of the sacred humanity of Christ, of which we spoke above, and the resulting failure to understand the love of Christ. We have said that this love is the axis of sanctification and of the whole of Christian life. Also necessarily leads to a distortion and watered down of love of neighbor itself. One sign of this distortion is the cry for peace which can be heard everywhere in the Church, and the failure to remember that Christ not only said that he came to bring peace, but that he also came to bring the sword. Love of neighbor is confused with a cheerful willingness to give in. No one longer understands that the real love of neighbor just as often has to say no to the wishes of his neighbor as yes. Through the disastrous shift of emphasis which lies in this worldliness, one has lost sight of the great drama of human existence, the fall of man, his redemption by Christ, the fact that justification calls for sanctification, the responsibility which we have as a result of the fact is a status viae, a pilgrimage, that we face the alternatives of eternal blessedness and damnation, of heaven and hell. True love of neighbor demands that we be awakened to this drama. Our unique interest in him is possible only when we see him in the light of this drama. Love of neighbor is impossible in the presence of mediocrity, of the repulsiveness of evil pride, of the deadly oppressive atmosphere of an enemy of God like Hitler, unless we see our neighbor in the light of the objective tragedy which these attitudes involve. Then we see in our neighbor a man who was created in the image of God, called by God to similitudo Dei, in personal sanctification and to eternal union with God, but who has brought up the most terrible guilt upon himself, who is facing the terrible judgment of God, who has rejected the redeeming hand of Christ. Only in this supernatural light, against the background of this tragedy, is it possible to show him true love of neighbor. As soon as we lose sight of the supernatural situation of man, and see everything in the light of this world, it not only becomes impossible to show love of neighbor towards the enemy of God, but this love is deprived of all its power and depth. No sooner has one forgotten that the eternal salvation of our neighbor has to be our main concern for him, then real love of neighbor becomes impossible. No sooner does one cease to understand that love of neighbor does not seek fulfillment of all his wishes, then this love becomes a weakness and a way of giving in. No sooner does one forget words of St. Augustine, "Kill the error, love him who errs," then one loses all understanding for real love of neighbor. Love of neighbor can be rightly understood when we realize that we live in a situation in which we are bound to reject all moral mistakes, and even many non-moral disvalues, in which we have to struggle against error and evil, struggle against them with all our might, but in which love of neighbor extends even to him who errs, who is evil, even to him who is the enemy of God. We can understand love of neighbor rightly and its holy power, only when we see it against the background of all those acts which reject what is wrong. To this we are called, indeed obliged. The mysteries of the faith interpreted as a means for love of neighbor. Some Catholics, who indeed believe in the dogmas, but who are primarily concerned with the improvement of the world, regard the Incarnation, the redemption, sanctifying grace, all as means for the growth of love of neighbor. They express this not so much in an explicit statement as in their attitudes. Fraternal charity seems to them the goal for the sake of which God does everything that he does. They no longer see the incomprehensible glory of the Incarnation as such, this manifestation of the infinite love and mercy of God, to fall down in adoration. They no longer see the ultimate seriousness of the economy of redemption, the horror of being separated from God, the in umbra mortis sedere, sitting in the shadow of death, and then the tremendous source of all true joy, the redemption through Christ, of which the Church sings at Easter. The Lamb has redeemed the sheep. Christ, who was innocent, has reconciled sinners to the Father. The redemption makes the eternal happiness of the individual possible, and this is incomparably more important than any earthly progress. When we say that such Catholics fail to understand the tremendous gift of sanctifying grace, which makes it possible for us to become holy, and thus, and this is the most important thing of all, to glorify God, they would protest that they do believe all this. But the proof that they have fallen prey to this worldliness is their unconscious tendency to look upon all this as a means, to set as their main goal fraternal charity and earthly peace. In this way, one becomes blind even to the real glory and specific value of love of neighbor. For, as we saw, this love is possible only as a fruit of our love for Jesus Christ. By its nature, it flows from a love very different in kind, from love for Christ and for God, in and through Christ. This love cannot be compared with any love for a creature. It is a value response to God's incomprehensible holiness. Love of neighbor is no longer understood in its specific value and as a glorification of God. Instead, one sees mainly its effect in improving the world. This is a particularly dangerous form of otherworldliness, because here the objective hierarchy of things is totally reversed, and one falls into a kind of religious utilitarianism without at all understanding its incompatibility with the teaching of the Church. Chapter 17. Is unity among the faithful the highest value? Only if we understand real love of neighbor and its holy fire and power, as we find this in St. Paul, we can understand that the anathema and excommunication are in no way opposed to the spirit of love of neighbor, but rather flow from its true spirit. Of course, I am not here speaking of a condemnation of the Church, which was followed by punishments and execution that were imposed by the state, as was the practice at the time of the Inquisition. These were, of course, wrong and contrary to the spirit of love of neighbor. I am rather speaking of the anathema as such, and of that excommunication which, first of all, solemnly and officially condemns an heretical teaching, and secondly, excludes the excommunicated person from the reception of the sacraments. In the case of a priest, it also necessarily suspends him. In the case of a theologian, removes him from his teaching position. Such a condemnation is an act of love of God and of neighbor. The anathema is an act of love of God because it condemns the offense against God which lies at the distortion of Christian revelation and of the teaching of the Holy Church, and because it officially unmasks error as error. The protection of the divine revelation has been entrusted to the Holy Church, and to fulfill this holy trust is a central act of holy obedience and of love for divine truth, and indeed for God himself. And it is an act of sublime love of neighbor to protect the faithful from the poison of false teaching, for it is a far more important and highly objective mood for man to remain in the true faith than to be relieved of his physical and psychic sufferings. The anathema is for men in statu viae, in their pilgrimage through life, something which protects that greatest good, which is so important for the salvation of their souls. It is thus a very great act of love, because it protects the faithful from the deceits of heretics, who speak in this name of the Church, especially when they hold a position of authority and thus belong to the ecclesia docens, the teaching church. These heretics are listened to with much sympathy and openness by the simple believing layman, and this makes it quite easy to seduce him to error and to poison his faith. It is not a more fundamental, deeper act of love of neighbor to protect the faithful by unmasking heretics, and suspending them if they hold any office of authority, than to protect men against a plague, or to mitigate their poverty, or even to eliminate social injustice. Let us consider how seriously the anathema takes man as one who is called to eternal blessedness, as one who has the great dignity of belonging to the mystical body of Christ. And even for him who is condemned, it is an act of the greatest love of neighbor. It is, for him, like a knife of a surgeon which cuts away the cancer of a patient. It is a fully earnest admonition, an enlightenment as to his errors, an invitation to return to the Church. It protects him from completely lapsing into heresy without fully realizing it. It enables him to grasp the full incompatibility of these theses with the teaching of the Holy Church, to feel the significance of his error, and with terrible seriousness it forces him to decide for or against God and his Holy Church. If a spark of true faith in Christ and his Holy Church still lives in him, he will turn away from the temptation which his heresy involves, and returns to the community of the Church. The vilification of the anathema, though it is through the anathema that the Church has preserved her identity and the purity of her teaching since St. Paul and throughout the centuries, is a typical consequence of the distorting love of neighbor, and of confusing this love with a weak cheerfulness, niceness, and readiness to give in. The fear of the anathema betrays, above all, a loss of the sensus supernaturalis, a lapse into this worldliness, which is more concerned with the earthly welfare of man than with his eternal salvation. The distortion of love of neighbor is also expressed in the confusion of love of neighbor with community. I have already gone into this grave error in my in the introduction to my book, Celibacy and the Crisis of Faith. I refer to it again here, not only because it is an especially disastrous error, but also because it is closely related to the vilification of the anathema and of excommunication. Ecumenism impossible towards heretics in the Church. It must be said again, with great emphasis, that we can speak of ecumenism only with regard to religious communities which claim to be something completely different from the Catholic Church. First of all, there is the Byzantine Orthodox Church, which is only schismatic. Secondly, there are believing Protestants who have for centuries not only been in schism, but have also formed a dogmatically distinct religious community. No Protestant would call himself Catholic or claim to speak in the name of the Holy Church. This holds even more for Jews, Muslims, Brahmins, or Buddhists. The attitude towards all these non-Catholics which Vatican II calls for under the name of ecumenism can never be meaningfully directed to heretics within the Church. The attitude which goes with true ecumenism, and it varies greatly according to the particular religion we are dealing with, involves sympathetically emphasizing the elements of truth in other religions, while clearly rejecting the errors which they contain. But this attitude is never appropriate towards a Catholic who wants to remain in the Church and spread heresies and teachings contrary to those of the Holy Church, and who often wants even to change the teaching of the Church. We should not keep any pseudo-community with these false teachers and destroyers of the Christian revelation and of Christian life in the Holy Church. Full community is not even possible with those who are outside the Church and who have separated themselves from her. But the attitude which is right towards our separated brothers would be wrong towards heretics in the Church. Of course, our love of neighbor must extend to these heretics, but even a certain loose community which is possible with our separated brothers, and there are many degrees of this community according to the different ones with whom we are dealing, is impossible with the heretics within the Church, because, willy-nilly, they are destroying the Church and poisoning her teaching, because they are abusing their apparent membership in her. Here we have to apply the words of St. John. If someone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not admit him to your house, or greet him, for whoever greets him shares in his evil deeds. 2 John 10:11. Truth and community. There is another great danger which goes together with the distortion of love of neighbor, the danger of putting community above truth, and of implicitly making peace the highest value. Unfortunately, this tendency to regard community as more important than truth is very widespread in the Holy Church today. The first great error which we find here is the separation of community from truth. All genuine community among men presupposes that they encounter one another in a certain realm of goods. The solidarity which comes from worshipping the same idol and working for it, or from working together for something false or evil, does not deserve the name of community. Such pseudo-community is a definite evil, and possesses a disvalue. The value which community possesses as such is here poisoned by the disvalue of that which brings people together, of that whose name they are united. Surely unity, community, has its own value. The unity of man is something of value not because it is the opposite of strife and struggle. It also has a value which is absent as long as individual men are indeed at peace, but not united in community. I have discussed the nature and value of the community in my book, Metaphysics of Community. But what has to be especially emphasized today is that the formal nature and above all the value of community as such depends exclusively upon that name in which men are united. Community based upon error or something evil not only has no value, it has definite disvalue. A pseudo-community built on some evil idol is something much worse than many individual, unrelated men who are in error or do evil. It is not only that which it is worse for many to fall into error or heresy than for one to do so. It is not a question merely of a quantitative increase. No, it is the very unity of those who encounter another in untruth and evil which gives birth to a pure disvalue and heightens the evil. The value of true community, the concordia, becomes in a pseudo-community a definite disvalue. Thus it is utterly impossible to separate community from truth, and to make community the most important thing. Community is dependent in both its nature and value on the truth on which it is built. Secondly, in the religious sphere, the thing of greatest value, that which glorifies God the most, is standing in the truth, possessing the true faith. Christ has said, "Go into the world and teach all peoples. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and whoever does not believe will be damned." Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16. The absolute importance which these words clearly ascribe to the true faith, to faith in the true revelation of Christ, is in no way affected by the definition of Vatican I that God can give eternal blessedness to all men who lead a life in accord with the highest norms they know of. The value of the truth and of the true faith is thus undeniably greater than that of community, even if we are speaking of a genuine natural community built up upon some real good. Indeed, the value of standing in the truth and confessing the true God is even greater than that of the marvelous community of the mystical body of Christ. For it is the true faith and in real love of God that community with him is constituted, and this is clearly the most important thing, and that from which all other community is dependent in its nature and value. The words of the Holy Thursday liturgy, "The love of Christ has brought us together and made us one," clearly expresses that it is only the love of Christ, which implies the true faith, which can establish this sublime unity among the faithful. This overemphasis on community, on unity among men, this tendency to put unity above the truth and orthodoxy, is a consequence of the disastrous this-worldliness, which is analogous to emphasizing love of neighbor, and the expense of the love of God. To hold that love of neighbor is the only manifestation of love of God and Christ, that they are both identical. One speaks hardly at all of the direct love for Christ, but makes up for this by speaking all the more of love and of neighbor. It is strictly analogous to placing community above orthodoxy. Chapter 18. The Cult of the Positive. We have already discussed the distortion of morality which follows from this worldliness. Now we have to go into the following. With the catchword positive as opposed to negative, the illusion is introduced that the avoidance of a sin is morally much less important than a purely positive moral deed. One criticizes the Decalogue for containing too many prohibitions. One reproaches the Christian with overemphasizing the avoidance of evil and underemphasizing the doing of positive good. Thus, today one constantly hears of the demand for improving the world by fighting against poverty and peace, but hears little about overcoming our pride, about the struggle against temptations to impurity, the struggle against Phariseeism, in a word, little about our own sanctification. Here we have to distinguish between two different errors. First, there is the this worldly tendency to substitute work towards improving the world for the sanctification of ourselves. Of this we have already spoken. It is the catastrophic tendency to concentrate our interest on improving the world instead of on glorifying God by our sanctification, and to fail to see the incomparable superiority of moral values over all merely morally relevant goods. But it is a second error with which we want to deal with here, the foolishness involved in the catchword positive. Let us consider first of all the superiority which a purely positive deed, such as giving alms, supposedly has over a deed which is considered negative, such as resisting sin. Of course, negative here does not mean negative in value, any more than positive means positive in value. It is not the antithesis between good and evil which is at stake here, but rather that between positive deeds and omissions, the difference between yes and no. One overlooks the fact that the conscious renunciation of sin is a fully positive act and possesses high moral value. Of course, the mere objective absence of a sin, desirable as this as in itself, does not possess a moral value. We can be pleased that someone has not murdered another, but we cannot rightly consider him as possessing moral values as a result. If he never came into a situation in which he was tempted to kill another, then in fact that no sin, no great moral wrong is committed, is indeed desirable, valuable, but it is only a pure absence of moral evil. With the absence of the murder, there is also the absence of a great objective evil for the one who would have been the victim. But it is only a potential value which we find in the pure absence of a possible evil. There is no positive moral value in it. A person does not become endowed with moral values simply because he is not stained with some grave moral disvalue. But the absence of a moral disvalue comes to possess a high moral value as soon as this absence is not just an objective fact, but the result of a conscious renunciation of all moral evil, of a full no to the temptation to do moral wrong. The conscious rejection of all moral evil is inseparably bound up with a will directed to the morally good. Thus, purity, which comes from a conscious rejection of everything impure, of every misuse of the sexual sphere, is a highly positive virtue. We have to understand once and for all that a value response which rejects something, such as indignation, is just as positive as a value response which affirms some good. The term positive loses all meaning as soon as one no longer looks at the object to which a given attitude refers, for the kind of response we give must and should accord with the kind of object with we are responding to. It is just as much required of us to reject error as to assent to truth. The rightness or inadequacy of our response is determined by the nature of that to which we respond. If we prescind from one object to which it refers, a yes has no priority over a no. Indignation over something evil is just as much a pure value response as enthusiasm for something good, because both of these responses are fitting and appropriate with respect to their objects, and are indeed required by them, and because furthermore they both belong together, they both have a value. They are both something positive. As soon as one separates a yes or a no from the object to which it refers, and confers the value on the yes as such, then positive takes on a totally different meaning. When I say above that it loses all meaning when separated from the object, I intended to use the word meaning, in the sense of which it can be applied to the relation between a response and its object. Of course, in eternity, there will no longer be any actualization of indignation, because there will be no more moral evil, nor any suffering. But this absence of indignation in heaven does not come from the fact that indignation, being an act of rejection, is bad, but rather from the fact that there will be no more objects endowed with those disvalues which demand indignation. The infinite superiority of a situation in which there are no more evils and nothing fit to be rejected by our response must not be taken as proof that it is always better for us to say yes than to say no. Furthermore, enthusiasm for the good is a source of happiness, whereas indignation over evil is not. The fact that some good with its objective value is realized is in itself a source of happiness, and calls for a response of joy. The fact of an evil, especially of a moral evil, is in itself something infinitely sad, and demands the response of grief and pain. Apart from the joy in which one case and pain in the other, the ability and right to be joyful is in itself a source of happiness, whereas the necessity and duty of being indignant is in itself a source of pain. But this never justifies us in detaching yes and no from the objects to which they refer. And besides, the no to evil and error is potentially present in every yes to the good and true. Here we have to make an essential distinction between the rejection of evil when it confronts us as a temptation, and the rejection of it when we see it in other persons. Saying no to all sins, which I could commit as a high moral value, and as something thoroughly positive, indignation over the sins of others is indeed also a response, which is morally called for, and is also thoroughly positive, but it does not have the same moral value. Saying no to temptation and sin is, a central part of the moral life of man. So is hatred of sin in general. Indignation over the sins of others, over the offense which they give to God, belongs in a different category of morally positive attitudes and does not play with the same central role which is played by the rejection of temptation. Still another important distinction is the following. The rejection of sin in my own life is a pure act of free will, whereas indignation over the offense given to God by others, as well as enthusiasm for their good deeds, is not the same way subject to my will, even if it is not beyond all freedom. But there are without a doubt types of persons who have a disposition to say no. There are men who feel better when they are rejecting evil in others. Their disposition is analogous to that of revolutionary types. They feel stronger and more independent as soon as they can protest. They would be unhappy if there were no opportunity to protest. It is as if they needed the existence of evils in order to come fully to themselves. They, of course, do not give a pure value response. It is a perversion to find it more satisfying to say no than to say yes, to feel stronger in protest, revolution, in negating, to think that it is more serious and necessary to denounce evil than to affirm the good. These men also see evil much more than good. They often overlook everything that is good and desirable, and even morally edifying, but they see clearly everything that is wrong. Now this disposition involves a regrettable and unfortunate lack of objectivity. But the opposite disposition is just as wrong. Men who are so harmless and unsuspecting that they overlook evil, and who are enthusiastic without reason, are also unobjective. Even if this attitude is more agreeable than the one which sees evil everywhere and is full of mistrust, just as the optimist is more agreeable than the pessimist, it is nevertheless morally just as defective. It involves a disvalue because of its lack of objectivity and blindness, and it does not have ultimate moral earnestness. This positivity is no value at all. But let us now consider the type to which we are referring in this chapter, the one who is not at all objective, who separates himself from the nature of the objects of his responses, and who approaches the world in an attitude which he had assumed long before approaching it. Here we enter the realm of prejudices, the realm where we speak of optimists and pessimists, where a purely subjective temperamental disposition modifies our relation to the world and replaces those meaningful responses which are dictated by the objects of our responses. This lack of objectivity is a disvalue. The optimist is perhaps a more agreeable person than the pessimist, but they are both caught up by a lack of objectivity, which is a disvalue. This lack of objectivity is much worse in the case of the man who is by temperament constantly annoyed without reason, and who inclines to complain about everything. But the disvalue which lies in the unobjectivity of annoyance, and as distinguished from anger, annoyance is never a value response, but always contains an unobjective element of subjective irritation, does not prove that it is always a mistake to say no, and does not prove that there is something wrong with the meaningful and required value response of indignation. Let us just mention still another way of rejecting evil, which must not be confused with the value responding rejection such as indignation, there is a pharisaical way of preferring to reject evil than to affirm the good. Sometimes such a person enjoys his superiority by dwelling on the mistakes of others. Sometimes he regards himself as morally outstanding by energetically condemning evil. All pharisaical self-enjoyment is incompatible with the spirit of true value response and is morally damnable. It possesses a great moral disvalue. But this disvalue is not in every gesture of rejection. It is not found in that indignation, which is appropriate to and called for by the immorality, but only in pharisaical self-enjoyment, that should be immediately clear to anyone. And so we have to emphasize again, the rejection of evil and of sin is a response which is purely positive and morally called for, and it possesses a high moral value. One cannot truly love God without hating the devil. One cannot really love the truth without hating error. One cannot find the truth and grasp it clearly as such without seeing through errors. Knowledge of truth is inseparably linked with knowledge of error, with the unmasking of error. All talk about the superiority of yes over no, about negativity of rejecting that which should be rejected, is so much idle chatter. In earlier times there were, of course, moral theologians who overemphasized the avoidance of sin and who underemphasized performing morally good deeds. Especially with regard to the whole sexual sphere, they spoke much of the disvalue of misuse, of often warning against sexual sins, but neglected to unfold the values of right use. One did not speak of the mystery of this sphere, of the mysterious union and self-donation in the consummation of marriage, of the great beauty of this becoming one flesh, which is an organic expression of spousal love and a fulfillment of the desire for union with the beloved, and of this union our Lord said, "And the two become one flesh," which is rooted in spousal love. One emphasized one-sidedly the disvalue of misusing sex, because one failed to see the great value of this God-given fulfillment of spousal love, and the great value of this mutual self-donation in marriage. Not until the wonderful allocutions of Pope Pius XII was this positive aspect of the sexual sphere fully recognized. Not until then was the value of the bodily union in marriage and its relation to spousal love proclaimed by the highest church authority. But the entire literature of the great theologians, St. Augustine, St. Thomas, Duns Scotus, St. Francis de Sales, Moeller, Scheban, Gratry, Newman, we find no emphasis on the avoidance of sin at the expense of good actions and attitudes. Here we come across an important point in the nonsense surrounding the catchword positive. One forgets that there is a hierarchy in our duties towards God. Our first duty is not to offend God by sin. Our second is to glorify Him by good deeds. We can express this philosophically by saying that our first moral task is not to introduce morally relevant evils into the world, and not to destroy morally relevant goods. For instance, not to torture or kill a man, not to commit injustice, consciously to spread error, or work for apostasy. Our second task is the mitigation or elimination of those morally relevant evils which we find, for instance, relieving the suffering of our neighbor, helping a sick person, fighting injustice, freeing those who are unjustly in prison, and above all, helping someone to find his way to God, helping him to convert the Holy Church. Only in coming to man's third moral task do we come to the producing of morally relevant goods, for instance, providing some happiness for another person, helping a gifted person to complete his studies, doing good for one's neighbor in different ways. This hierarchy has a definite character. It is not a hierarchical order which says that what must come first has a greater value than what comes second or third. It is rather a hierarchy which refers to our tasks, our mission. What is the first thing which is morally demanded of us? Or, as we could ask, what is the minimum? The answer to this question is not necessarily that which is most important. Avoiding moral evil, and we commit evil in producing morally relevant evils or in destroying morally relevant goods, although it is something negative, has priority over the realization of morally relevant good, which is something positive. The priority of the negative over the positive is an objective fact that has nothing to do with the negative attitude of moral pessimism, nothing to do with an overemphasis on disvalues. It is no sign of a negative attitude to emphasize the priority of avoiding sin. We avoid offending God by sin when we abstain from bringing into being morally relevant evils, as well as from rebellion against God and all negative attitudes which make a direct gesture of defiance against God, such as cursing, indifference to God, etc. This omission of what is morally bad and of sin is an eminent expression of obedience and love of God. It is a definite value response. It is a total misunderstanding to call this omission negative in comparison with bringing morally relevant goods into being, or with actively relieving the need of another or working to improve the world. There are, of course, sins which come from neglecting to do some good thing. These play a great role in the gospel, as when Christ says, "I was thirsty, and you did not give me to drink, naked, and you did not clothe me." Matthew 25:35. These belong in the class of our second moral task, the mitigation of the evils which exist. But it is deeply meaningful that in the Ten Commandments, the negative ones, the prohibitions, the second, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, play such a great role, and that Christ, too, gives us prohibitions when he condemns Pharisaism, pride, distraction, the tendency today to speak little of avoiding sin and to emphasize doing good, all under the slogan, "We want to be more positive," is a clear distortion of the moral sphere. It is at bottom a utilitarian lack of interest in moral values as distinguished from morally relevant values. These are so many symptoms and consequences of the disastrous this worldliness. Natural and worldly goods. We mention above that there is a certain disposition which sees everything negative more clearly, and then the opposite disposition which sees everything positive first of all and more clearly. And we also discuss the lack of objectivity in the pessimist and the optimist. Now we want to emphasize how important it is from a religious point of view to see objectively the whole situation of our earthly life and of the world as we know it. That is, to see objectively the two real existing aspects of the world. Here we see how wonderfully the Holy Church has expressed the existence of both aspects of her liturgy. Earth is called a vale of tears, and yet it says in the Gloria, "Heaven and earth are full of your glory." Even earth contains great goods which proclaim the goodness, glory, and beauty of God. In the phrase "vale of tears," the tragedy of human life is fully recognized, especially the fearfulness of death, the disharmony which was brought into the world by the fall, and which continues even after our redemption by Christ, the tragedy of the temporal triumph of evil, all the unhappy marriages, all children who have gone astray, all disappointments, and, most of all, as the greatest human cross, the death of beloved persons. On the other hand, when it says, "Heaven and earth are full of your glory," the magnificence of creation is recognized, the beauty of nature, which speaks to us of the infinite glory of God, the deep happiness which is conferred on us by the beauty of nature and of all great art, the unspeakable glory of a great human love. What an invention of God is marriage! How marvelous that there exists some fulfillment of spousal love, such as a union between persons is possible. What a great gift of God it is to that, as the beautiful Fulda ritual says, the coming into being of new human beings is entrusted to the sweet love between man and woman. And what a gift is the ability to know. Here I speak not only of the general ability to know which belongs to the nature of the person, but also of the ability to attain systemic knowledge, and especially true philosophical knowledge. Of this Socrates says in his Apology, number 41, referring to his condition after death, "But then I will be able to continue my investigation of true knowledge and of pseudo-knowledge, just as in this world I have tried to find out who is wise and who only says that he is without really being so that I will continue this investigation in the next world." Indeed, what a gift is being itself, our existence as persons, as well as what Goethe calls des Lebens holde Gewohnheit. We cannot continue here going through the magnificence of creation, the riches of all great natural goods, which are different from merely worldly goods. Let us just refer to some of the saints and holy men in the Church who have sung the praises of the message of God, to be found even in natural creation. St. Augustine, St. Anselm, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, Cardinal Newman, Pope Pius XII. In order to fully understand and duly appreciate the great natural goods, we have to understand the following first. We have to distinguish these real natural goods from merely worldly goods, such as wealth, power, fame, influence. All these are only Utenda, things to be used, never Freunde, things to be rested in and enjoyed. Here I can only refer to my detailed discussion in my book, The Sacred Heart. Worldly goods are by no means bad in themselves, but they contain great danger. They are to be used as means to something else, to be used in order to do good, to bring value into being, but not to be aimed at for their own sake and to be enjoyed. Secondly, real natural goods show their ultimate value only in Christ. That is, only when their message from God and His infinite glory is understood, as for instance St. Francis of Assisi understood the beauty of nature. Natural goods are really understood only when we see how they point beyond themselves to something infinitely higher, and seem to say to us, as St. Augustine puts it, we are not the source of ultimate happiness. It is a great mystery that they show us their innermost depth, their ultimate value, only when they do not regard them as the highest good. Then we do not take them just in themselves, separate from everything else, but see them in the light of infinitely superior natural goods, in the light of the infinite beauty and holiness of Christ. Thirdly, everything gets its true background, its ultimate proportions, from the revelation of Christ, from knowing the meaning of our life, knowing that life is a status viae, state of pilgrimage, knowing the truth of the promise which lies in all great natural goods. For all these goods point beyond themselves and contain, as it were, the promise that there must be an eternal life, an absolute world, of which they are just messengers. If there were no life after death, no eternal blessedness, then all these great earthly goods would be merely a facade, an illusion. They would promise something which does not exist. Plato has a deep intimation of this. But it is not until the revelation of Christ that we learn of the full reality of that which the natural goods somehow promise. Only the revelation of Christ triumphs over the deep tragedy which surrounds all these goods because death, and because of their transitoriness. And above all, the redemption of Christ opens for us the way to a world of glory which does not pass away, a world where God wipes away all tears. The revelation of Christ has not only disclosed to us the world of supernatural glory, the world of holiness, which infinitely surpasses the beauty of all the greatest natural goods, our redemption through Christ's death on the cross, and the communication to us of the supernatural principle of life in baptism, has opened for us the way to eternal blessedness, and has given us hope of it. This radically changes the nature of the vale of tears. Of course, in one sense, the seriousness of life and the tragedy of the vale of tears is heightened by our knowing of the true situation of man, by knowing of this alternative of eternal blessedness or eternal punishment in hell. In addition to all natural suffering, there is added for the believer the holy fear of eternal damnation. Just as we say in Dies Irae, "Oh, what will I then say in my wretchedness? What protector will I call to my defense, when even the just are hardly safe?" But still, our whole life in statu viae, on pilgrimage, in this vale of tears, is filled with light, because our hope of the beatific vision for all eternity, our hope for an indestructible communion of love face to face with Christ. The primacy of joy over all suffering is revealed to us in Christ. Thus the joyful aspect of creation, as distinguished from its vale of tears aspect, necessarily presupposes the primacy of natural goods over all natural goods, even the highest ones. As soon as the absolute primacy of supernatural goods is no longer seen, and the glorification of God through our sanctification no longer concerns us more than all natural goods, then we become blind to the true value of natural goods and to the happiness which they give. We lose a sense of their hierarchy, and even of the difference between a world and natural goods. Thus the shift of stress to this world in no ways involves a deeper appreciation of real natural goods. The positive attitude towards the world which goes with this worldliness is in reality, although some are proud of it, that unjustified optimism which Bernanos rightly called a substitute for hope designed for idiots and cowards. This positive attitude comes only from forgetting the words of Christ. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his soul? Matthew 16:26. Let us summarize. First, the chatter about the priority of the positive, the slogan, "We must approach positively the tendencies of our time. It is better to affirm them than deny. The anathema and excommunication are too negative," is a foolish and dangerous error. For to reject what is false and untrue is just as positive to affirm what is true. To reject what is evil is just as positive as to affirm what is good. And besides, both are inseparably linked. The affirmation of truth and the love of that which is implicitly contained in every rejection of untruth or evil, which is objectively justified, and vice versa. Secondly, every positive action and the attitude which is not meaningfully directed to some object is just as bad a prejudice as a negative action or attitude which is not meaningfully directed at some object. Thirdly, one can understand that the world is full of the glory of God only in understanding that it is a vale of tears. As soon as one is denied at the expense of the other, both the positive and the negative are distorted. Fourthly, true understanding for natural goods is so linked with the absolute primacy of supernatural goods that the shift of emphasis to this world does not deepen our grasp of the value of natural goods, but renders it mediocre. Although we supposedly leave our ghetto by primarily emphasizing the improvement of the world, this is in reality no positive attitude, but rather a loss of true positivity. We attain to true positivity only in directing our glance to eternity, only in being concerned with the glorification of God through our sanctification, only in leading a life that is permeated by the realization that we are redeemed by Christ and have hope of seeing him in the beatific vision. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. The true mission of the Church is not to improve the face of the world, but to glorify God by the sanctification of men, and to secure their salvation. To shift the emphasis from eternity to the future, to devote all our energies to a happy earthly future for mankind, for progress towards a better world, to mobilize men for this ideal, to neglect the glorification of God, the sanctification of the individual, and his eternal blessedness, would not only deprive the Church of her raison d'etre, reason for being, but would condemn mankind to sit in the shadow of death. In order to see clearly the use of positive and negative as slogans, let us, in conclusion, distinguish this from another and legitimate use of these terms. In the history of the Church, there have been two different attitudes towards the great natural goods. The one has been called the positive way, the other the negative. In his book, Abbot Butler has referred to these two ways in the Church. According to the negative way, total abandonment to Christ necessarily involves a turning away from all natural goods. One should love only God for his own sake. All natural goods are only means for this. Only God is a true object of fruit, resting in and enjoying. All other things are the object of uti, using. This was the view of St. Augustine right after his conversion at the time of his soliloquies. But later he changed his attitude towards natural goods and required only that one love them all in God, and love God infinitely more than them, as he said, "Husband, love your wife, and wife, love your husband, but love Christ still more." We find this negative attitude to natural goods in Dionysius the Areopagite, in the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, in St. John of the Cross. We find the positive attitude in the later works of St. Augustine and St. Bonaventure, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Francis de Sales, and Cardinal Newman. Both attitudes have been recognized in the Church as completely compatible with the Christian revelation. I must admit that in all my works I have defended the positive attitude to natural goods by showing the mission which natural goods have led us to God, and by emphasizing the possibility and value of amare in Deo, loving them in God. But the term positive and negative have here a totally different meaning from their meanings as slogans, and both the positive way and the negative way in the Church are equally and radically opposed to that shift of emphasis to this world which is praised as positive. For we find the absolute primacy of supernatural goods in both of the two classical ways. In neither of them is there any shift of emphasis to this world. In the representatives of the positive way, we find concern with glorifying God, with commerce initime, with Jesus. Both ways are directed to eternity and not to an earthly future. In both there is the same passionate love for holiness, the same great striving for sanctification. In both contemplation plays a great role next to action. In both our first moral task is seen to be the avoidance of offending God by sin. So we see that positive and negative, as designations of two different attitudes towards great natural goods, have nothing to do with the use of these terms in the slogan, "Let us above all be positive. Let us concern ourselves less with the condemnation of heresies and with opposition to sin, and more with the improvement of social conditions in the world."